Okay, quick check that the screen visible, David.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Arish. I'm a product manager with the Microsoft Purview Audit team. And today we'll be giving you a walkthrough of what Purview Audit is all about. So when you first hear the word audit, many of you might think of the financial audit. That's the more commonly understood definition. In a way, the audit terminology in a security or compliance landscape is sort of similar. In the sense, a financial audit also looks at what has happened within a financial system. You look at all of the transactions. And when you come to the security and compliance landscape, to an extent, we do something similar. So what audit does is it powers all of your forensic and compliance investigations. And the way it does this is by looking at all of the transactions or activities that are happening within your Microsoft tenant. So how does Microsoft power these forensic and compliance investigations through audit? Firstly, audit serves as a centralized store for thousands of activities that users and systems and applications perform within a Microsoft tenant. Once these activities are recorded, these logs help organizations effectively respond to security events, forensic investigations, or any compliance or regulatory obligations that a company needs to tend to. These logs are also available to be tapped into as important evidence for investigations. So for example, you have audit activities like mail items accessed, mail send, what documents or what emails a user is searching for, which can be extremely critical when working on a forensic investigation. It allows you to identify what a bad actor has done within your tenant. It helps you identify what the blast radius is going to be in certain scenarios. And to an extent, audit also serves as sort of like the starting point for a lot of these investigations. Microsoft also allows you to preserve audit logs for up to 10 years, and this can be customized as we look at some examples later in the presentation today. And lastly, how can somebody access all of these audit logs? So there's multiple ways by which you can access audit logs. You can do it through UI, and we'll look at an example of that on the Microsoft Purview portal, the compliance portal, or you can do it programmatically. So if you have your own custom built applications within your organization, then these applications can also, through an API, read these audit logs, and we'll look at an example of that as well. So this slide is sort of like a mental model for auditing. This explains what auditing is, how it works. So the three boxes that you see here are the three core pillars of Purview audit. So the first box on the top left is the generation of audit logs. So we currently have about 75 to 80 workloads which generate audit records, which means that whenever a user performs some activity within each of these workloads, these activities generate corresponding audit records, which are then sent to us, and I'll walk you through that pipeline. So a workload corresponds to any of these Microsoft solutions. For example, you see the logo of Microsoft Word in there. Word is a workload, Teams is a workload, Outlook is a workload, and so on. So today we have about 75 to 80 such workloads across Microsoft. Once these logs are generated, they are sent to storage, where these logs are retained for up to 10 years. And from this long-term storage, the logs can be retrieved based on your scenario. So the first method, or the most commonly understood method of retrieval, is through the UI. And at the bottom left, you can see a tiny snippet. We'll look at an enlarged version of that and an example later on. So through the UI, you can submit certain conditions or filters which help you craft the search query. So you can say, hey, I'm only interested in operations like message sent within Teams, or I'm interested in all Teams logs, or I'm interested in logs specific to John Doe or activities that John Doe has performed on a certain file. So the UI and the other methods of retrieval allow you to filter out specific activities, specific scenarios, so that you're looking at a very scoped set of audit logs. There's also automation and programmatic access, which I spoke about earlier, which is supported through the PowerShell commandlet. And now more recently, also the Graph API, which became generally available a month ago. So just to summarize this slide, which is the mental model for auditing, the first pillar is generation of audit logs, and then you have retention up to 10 years. And then depending on your scenario or your requirement, you retrieve these audit logs. So some of the common business drivers for auditing, and I won't go through every single example here, you can read it on the slide. So compliance and regulatory support is one of the most common scenarios where auditing drives value. So for example, we have regulations across the world like GDPR and HIPAA, which require certain activity logs to be maintained. And in certain scenarios, you must furnish these logs as evidence. Auditing helps ensure that these activities are tracked and logged within your tenant for the right duration. Certain regulations require, in Europe, there's certain financial regulations which require logs related to BFSI industries to be retained for about 7 years. So audit drives that scenario as well. Second value add from auditing is troubleshooting. Given that audit serves as a record of everything that's happening within a particular Microsoft solution, in a lot of scenarios, audit logs are able to help figure out what happened, why a certain application behaved in a certain way, or how a certain outcome was reached. So such troubleshooting requirements are also served by auditing. And lastly, and the most importantly, the forensic investigation capability, which audit provides to help you identify what a particular bad actor or a certain threat agent did in a certain scenario is one of the core values that audit provides. A couple of examples here. Again, I won't go through all of them. A couple of industry-specific examples where auditing is helpful. So we looked at the compliance and regulatory requirements as one of the business drivers in the previous slide. Within the pharmaceutical industry, auditing helps by demonstrating a comprehensive trail for every step in the drug approval process, and in certain geographies, this is a mandated FDA requirement. Similarly, in the banking industry, if you look at the right side of your slide, banks can leverage audit features to track financial transactions that are happening. And in certain scenarios, this also helps monitor and prevent money laundering, IP theft, record tampering, etc. There's also the very common scenario of threat investigation, which we looked at as the third business driver in the previous slide, where audit provides and drives a lot of value. As promised earlier, I told you that we'll take an example and walk through what the audit search experience looks like within the Microsoft Purview portal. And that's what we're going to do right now. So think of an admin, a security admin, who's come across a problem and they're doing a security investigation in which there is a requirement where they want to know all instances in which somebody deleted a file between, say, 5th and 10th June. They suspect that something malicious may have happened a few months ago, and therefore they're looking back at data and they want to look at the relevant audit records to help identify what happened, who did what, and was there something of concern that happened during that time frame. So the example we're looking at is give me all instances where somebody deleted a file between 5th to 10th June. So this slide shows you a snapshot of what the Purview portal audit search experience looks like. So the way to navigate to this spot is within the Purview portal. If you search for auditing, or in the list of solutions, if you select auditing, it takes you to this page. On the left panel, you'll see two tabs. One says search, one says policies. If you click on search, it gives you this page where there's a bunch of filters and fields for you to play with. And we'll use this example to work through that. So the top left, on the top left corner, you have a calendar or a date picker, which allows you to scope down your audit logs based on the date range that you're looking at. In some scenarios, if you require a specific time range, that filter can be added as well. So because our example was for June 5th to June 10th, that's the date filter we've applied. Next, we'll scope our audit logs to just this particular activity of deleting a file. As of today, we have over 4,000 unique activities which are audited across those 80 Microsoft solutions.
Arish?
Yeah.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt. We're still getting issues with the slides overlaying. I was wondering, maybe me or David could present the deck and see if that fixes things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to propose.
Right. So the example that we were looking at was between July 5th to July 10th, we want to know whenever somebody deleted a file. So from the second filter, which is the activities friendly names dropdown, I'm gonna search, or I can scroll down and select deleted file as the activity. There's about 4,000 unique activities currently, but for this example, this is the only one we're interested in. If you can go to the next slide, there's also user filters and file folder or site filters, which allow you to specifically identify or filter down if you're interested in deletion of a particular file or activities performed by a specific user. You can apply those filters as well. So once I've filled in all of the parameters that I want to scope my audit search based on, the last thing I'll do is I'll give my search query a name. I'm just going to call it June file deletions, so that later on it's easy for me to reference, hey, what was this query that I was looking at? And in the next slide, I'm going to click on search. What this does is it creates a new search query in the list of queries that you see at the bottom of the screen. So now you see June file deletions is a new query that's been created. The job status says queued. It'll take a while to run. You can go get a coffee, get back, and perhaps the status will now move to 100%. At the top of the screen, you can also see active searches is now the count shows 1, which means there's one search which is actively running at this point. And in the next slide now, we can see, sorry, just back on the previous slide. So once this search completes, you can click on this and export the audit logs, and you'll get a CSV of all of the audit all of the audit records for file deletions in that period. Up next, we'll look at a walkthrough of custom retention policies, which is the second main feature area within auditing. There was also a question in chat about this on how the 10-year retention works. That's something we'll look at. So in the next slide, we have a list of default retention policies. Now, audit logs can be retained all the way up to 10 years. However, the exact retention period of a particular audit record depends on multiple factors. First, there is something called a default retention, which is based on what license you purchase. So within auditing, there are two tiers. The first is audit standard, which comes with any E3 or E3 equivalent license. So E3, if you're a Gov customer, then G3, in the education space, you have A3 and so on. So any E3 or E3 equivalent license will grant you access to audit standard, which gives you a default retention of 180 days. The second tier within auditing is audit premium, which comes with an E5 or E5 equivalent license, like G5, A5, and so on. Now, audit premium gives you a default retention of 1 year for these 4 specific Microsoft solution logs. So Entra, Exchange, OneDrive, and SharePoint logs will by default be retained for 1 year. All other logs will by default be retained for 180 days. However, and here's where some of the magic lies, audit premium also gives you access to custom retention policies. Now, custom retention policy allows you to define your own retention policies. If you want all of these other logs to also be retained for 1 year, you can do that. So audit premium grants you access for custom retention policies to be defined up to 1 year. You can keep it lower. So for example, if you're like, hey, I don't want Entra logs to be retained for the full 1 year, which is the default policy, you can reduce that. You can reduce it to say 30 days, 7 days as well. So custom retention policies allow you to create these policies for retention up to 1 year. You can specify certain logs to be retained for shorter, certain logs to be retained for longer, logs of certain users to be retained for shorter or longer. That's supported as well. And then the last tier is there is a 10-year add-on license, which can be purchased on top of your existing audit premium, which comes from the E5 license. So this 10-year add-on SKU grants you access up to 10 years. You already have custom retention with which comes with E5 as part of audit premium. And now you can create these custom retention policies, not just up to 1 year, but all the way up to 10 years. So a lot of our BFSI customers use this extensively, especially in Europe, to retain certain categories of logs for 7 years, which is a regulatory requirement for them. In the next slide, we'll look at an example of how can you go about creating these these custom retention policies. So on the left tab, the left panel, you see policies as one of the options. You can click on that, or on the main screen, you can select audit retention policies at the top. In the next slide, you'll see that this takes you to a different screen where you have a list of custom policies that perhaps you have created in the past or somebody else within your tenant may have created in the past. So if you can look at the first row, mail logs 10 years is one of the custom policies that somebody's created, which applies to a certain category of logs. And there's a priority set, and I'll walk you through an example to explain what these fields mean. So in the next slide, you'll see that there's a highlight on this Create Audit Retention Policy button. If you click on that, and the next slide shows you a panel that opens up on the side where you can enter a policy name, describe the policy, and below this, you can enter the parameters which define the scope of logs on which the policy should apply. So you see, please choose users or records for this policy to apply to. So you can specify certain users if you only want this policy to apply to them, or you can leave it blank if you want it to apply to everybody. Similarly, you can filter by specific record types. So if I only want this policy to apply to exchange logs or only Teams logs, then I can do that. So in the next slide, we'll walk through an example where now I am creating a custom policy to apply for SharePoint, to retain SharePoint file operations for 5 years. Now, if you remember, SharePoint was one of those sample workloads, one of those 4 workloads for which the default retention is 1 year. Now, in my scenario, I want to increase this and I want to retain these logs for 5 years. So I'm going to create a custom policy. I've given it a name. In the dropdown of record type, I've selected those relevant record types, so SharePoint file operations, list operations, and so on. In the second, the middle screenshot, you can see the duration that I'm setting. So from the dropdown, you can set 5 years. If you have a different requirement, you can keep it shorter, 6 months, 3 months, 7 days, or all the way up to 10 years. In this particular example, the admin has the 10-year add-on license, so they're able to do this. And then once all of this is done, I can give it a priority. So in my example, I've given it a priority of 20. Now, what does priority mean? Think of a scenario where the same audit logs are part of multiple custom retention policies. So suppose I create a retention policy which says retain SharePoint logs for 5 years, and somebody else creates a policy that says retain all logs for 4 years. So how do you resolve this? But you do that by setting priority. So the lower priority is given precedence. By default, think of the default retention policies as having infinite priority, which means any custom policy that you create will always overrule the default policy. In the next slide, you can see once I save this, the custom policy is created. It can take up to a day for this to take effect. And once this is done, all of the new logs that are generated will now honor the new retention. So that was an example of how custom retention policies are created. Up next, we'll do a quick walkthrough of what's recently been rolled out within auditing. If you could go to the next slide, David. Yeah, next one. So the Audit Search Graph API, this is something that we rolled out recently and is now generally available for commercial as well as our Gov customers. The Search Graph API is one of the programmatic ways to access audit logs. It is an asynchronous search experience, which means that when I submit a search query, I don't necessarily have to wait for it to complete. I can go do other things in case of there's so previously we had a synchronous search experience where if there was a timeout, you had to rerun the entire query all over again. So the Search API allows you to prevent those issues. This is significantly more reliable. It has fewer timeouts compared to the Search Unified Audit Log Commandlet, which was the older way to programmatically access logs. And for the first time, we now offer granular permissions so that you can scope your access to logs at a workload level. So in some of our large customers, they have a requirement where they have a separate security admin to look at Exchange logs, a separate admin to look at SharePoint logs, and investigations and forensic investigations and regulatory requirements are also siloed based on certain workloads. So in these scenarios, you can scope your access to logs and you can say, hey, I only want one admin to have access to Exchange logs, a different admin to have access to SharePoint logs. That can now be done for the first time using the Graph API. Okay, up next in the next slide, we have blanket custom retention policies for all record types. Previously, you had to manually specify certain record types that you want the custom retention policy to apply to. If you wanted it to apply to all, then it was a tedious process of having to scroll down and select all of them. It was a pain. So now you can, there's an option to select all of them by default. What this also does is, in the future, as new solutions onboard to auditing and we expand our scope to audit more activities and more record types, this will ensure that you don't need to go back and modify your custom retention policy to include these new logs. If you select all, then it means by default, any new logs that we introduce, those will get covered in your custom retention policy as well. Up next, and this is sort of one of my pet favorites, we have new logs for audit activities, or as I like to call it, auditing for auditing. So far, we had been auditing a whole bunch of about 75 to 80 workloads across Microsoft, but we weren't auditing audit itself, which meant that if somebody went to Purview Audit, submitted a search request and exported a whole bunch of logs, these activities weren't audited. So just like you monitor others, you need to monitor yourself as well. So now we have auditing for auditing, which means that whenever somebody creates an audit search or deletes some search history or exports some of these search results and logs, these generate audit records as well. And now by nature, audit records are immutable. Once an audit record is generated, it can never be tampered, edited, deleted whatsoever. It will remain untouched till it reaches its retention period. During that time, nobody can alter it. So it serves as this concrete proof that a certain activity has taken place within your tenant. Okay, up next, we have a quick snapshot of what's coming up in auditing. In the next slide, we have an example of what's new that's coming in. So in the example that we looked at earlier in the presentation, where an admin was looking at file deletions of a certain date range, we walked through all of the filtering options that are available within the audit UI experience. We are now introducing a few additional filters: record ID, user type, user key, client IP. Client IP, for example, is very useful in certain investigations where you want to know what are the activities that have taken place from a certain IP address. So if you see some malicious or suspicious activity from a particular IP address, and you want to know what are the other activities that have taken place or other files that were accessed from that IP address, you can now filter out all logs of a certain IP address using this property. Similarly, user key allows you to uniquely identify activities from a particular user. In some of our customer scenarios, they don't have visibility into the user ID. So while they cannot uniquely identify using PII who that particular user is, the user key allows you to still do user level scoping, but in an obfuscated manner. User type categorizes whether the primary actor was just a regular user, a user with admin privileges, was it an application that performed that activity, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of scenarios that user type allows you to categorize your logs into. And record ID is a unique identifier for each audit record that's generated. In some troubleshooting scenarios, this becomes extremely useful to be able to filter based on record ID. And up next, we have auditing user interactions with AI. So right at the beginning, if you remember, I talked about how auditing has evolved over the past year and a half, 2 years, to ensure that we audit all activities that AI does. Now we are working on further enriching this, expanding the scope. There's going to be a whole bunch of exciting announcements at Microsoft Ignite next week related to this. So keep an eye out and an ear out for those announcements. We're now going to be expanding the scope of Purview and Audit to a whole bunch of new scenarios as well. I won't get into too much details yet. That's going to be announced at Ignite. Okay, so I think this wraps up all I had to cover. I'll just do a quick walkthrough of the questions that have been posted on chat so far. I know there's quite a few. Meanwhile, David, if you want to call out a few questions that have got a lot of likes, I can take those first.
Yeah, we have a few questions. So I'll just go through the unanswered ones. The first is the underlying technology of Graph API RESTful API?
Yes, that's right.
Great. The next one is, can you describe the 10-year license add-on? Which accounts need this license?
You can purchase that add-on for that particular user. So it isn't a tenant-wide license. It is a user-specific license. Typically, the most common scenario where we've seen customers purchasing this is in BFSI, where there is a regulatory requirement for certain categories of audit logs to be retained for 7 years. There's a specific regulation that requires this. And even within that particular scenario, not all users within a particular tenant need to have that. So it can be extremely specific. It varies a lot based on what your requirement is. But since you have the flexibility to purchase these licenses at a user level, you can do that, customize it based on your requirement. Now, the way this retention works is once you purchase the 10-year add-on license, it doesn't by default increase your retention for all logs to 10 years. The default still remains 1 year for those 4 special workloads and 180 days for the others. In order to increase the retention to 10 years, you need to create a custom policy in which you specify which logs you want to increase, or if you want all logs, then you can specify that as well. And that is what increases the retention to 10 years. So just purchasing it will not increase the retention.
Great, thank you. The next question is, does audit log retention impact our SharePoint storage capacity?
No, it does not.
Great. The next question is, are these the same event logs that can be sent to SIEM or Sentinel, or are they different log events?
Very interesting. So Sentinel consumes logs from a whole bunch of sources. You could technically do a bulk export of these logs and import it into any SIEM, Sentinel being one of them. So Sentinel, within Sentinel, there is an option to import logs from Purview Auditing. It's one of the very commonly used sources of data.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how can we quantify the volume of audit logs in Purview for 110,000 users?
Sorry, could you come again?
How can we quantify the volume of audit logs in Purview for 110,000 users?
So if you just want to know the volume of logs in terms of count, so there's no straightforward way wherein you'll be able to view this total count across, say, hundreds of thousands of users. A workaround, which might be very tedious, is to programmatically run multiple search queries, break it down at a user level or a group level, and export and get the count. But that's going to take a while. That's going to be tedious. If you could explain why you're interested in this count, perhaps I'll be able to share a more specific recommendation. If you could add that in the chat, please.
Okay, we'll circle back. The next question is there a data connector in Sentinel to import these audit logs?
Yes, there is.
Great. The next question is, when generating an audit report, how can we identify detailed information such as what type of access was given to a company link created?
Let me read through this question again. When generating an audit report, how can we identify detailed information such as what type of access was given? Okay, so whenever you have some user performing activities related to change in permissions or any roles that are granted, these generate the relevant intra audit logs. Within these, you would have, within each audit record, you would have certain metadata, which helps you identify further details of what specific activity took place. So Relevant to access, you would have within the entry audit logs, you would have details of what was the nature of the role or some identifier for a particular role or role group or permissions that were either created or granted to a specific user. So if that is the activity that's performed, you could filter out from the search experience, you could filter out those logs, export them, and you could look at the metadata within that to identify these details.
Great, thank you. The next question is, which is a fundamental certification for Purview?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
All right, well, we'll see if they clarify.
Okay.
The next question is, if a user is deleted and therefore loses their license, is the audit log kept for the full length of time? Also, is there any way for app at SharePoint events to be kept as they are not user-based?
Absolutely. So audit records, once generated, it's going to remain till the retention period expires. So even if a user account is deleted or the user leaves the organization, the audit records for that user are going to remain till the scheduled retention expires. So suppose you have a 10-year retention scenario, but that particular user has left the organization or their user account is deleted. The retention applies at the time when the log is generated. So if today the log was generated and tomorrow I leave an organization, the retention that was applied today is going to stick around till the end of the lifetime. So if the 10-year retention applies to a log that's generated today, that cannot be changed. It cannot be purged or expired earlier. It will remain till the end of retention.
Great. The next question is, are these audit logs the same as what is in Activity Explorer?
Yes, Activity Explorer, in fact, references these audit logs as the source of data.
Great, thank you. And then we did get some feedback from the person who asked about the 110,000 users. They said, we want to activate the audit logs in Purview, but don't know how to do it step by step because it seems to only be activated only at the tenant level. So for 110,000 users, we are a bit worried.
Okay. So when you enable auditing within your tenant, this enables auditing across all user mailboxes. Within Exchange auditing, there is a provision where you can enable or disable auditing for Exchange auditing specifically for certain users. So if you're worried that you're going to have a very high number of users whose activities are being audited, and for whatever reason you don't want that, I'm not sure why it would be a concern. I don't think you should be worried. Most of this isn't going to increase your retention or billing or of storage in any way. So from that perspective, it shouldn't really be a concern. But if there is some reason for which you don't want to enable it for all users, there is a provision within mailbox auditing specifically to disable it for certain users. Now, if you look at audit volume, the highest audit log volume is generated by Exchange or Outlook. And if volume is a concern, then I think controlling mailbox auditing is going to address that to a huge extent. This is available in public documentation on how you can enable or disable mailbox auditing for specific users. If you can reference that, that would be great.
Great, thank you. We did get clarification on that certification question. It says, is there a fundamental certification for Purview like that of Azure Fundamental?
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to check and get back to you.
Okay. The next question we have is, can we audit user interactions to cloud storage solutions like OneDrive, Google Drive, ChatGPT, or Dropbox if we don't have an enterprise account?
So there are certain connectors which can be integrated with auditing. However, you would so audit is part of Purview, which is typically sold as part of enterprise licensing. So you would need an enterprise license or a gov license or an educational license to be able to access auditing. So short answer would I believe be no. You would need enterprise access.
Great. And then we did get one question that seems roadmap related. I will put in the chat a link to our private communities. That would be a great place to take up that question. This is a public call, so we actually are not at liberty to discuss things of that nature. And that seems to be all the questions we had. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Arish, for being our guest and for sharing the great information with our community. Also, thank you to the team who helped us with answering the questions and providing the resourceful information. To all the listeners still on the line, if you're someone who wishes to aid in the protection of the world from cyber threats and desire to have a say in shaping our strategies, blueprints, and recommendations, then we invite you to become part of our security community. Together, we can make a global impact. So join us at aka.ms/security community. This is also where you'll be notified about the upcoming webinars, events, and other announcements. For those of you who may have additional questions on the topic we just covered or other product-related questions, please feel free to raise them on our Microsoft Tech Community discussion space at aka.ms/Azure Purview Community. Thank you all for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.